question is whether or not this is something which is simply too draconian, too austere, that simply does not reflect the long-standing humanitarian traditions of this country, and indeed sends exactly the wrong signal to our international partners, and also with governments and regimes which are far less humane than ours. It represents a departure from established norms and principles of international law. And ultimately, make no mistake, what this represents is that if you have someone arrive from a country with as many problems as Afghanistan, something you can argue we had a direct hand in, from countries which are war-torn, what's going on in Sudan at the moment, for example, potentially modern slaves as well, because part of this, as Theresa May, the architect of that legislation, has herself said, unpicks Britain's legislative framework around modern slavery. It will represent, those people will arrive and they will have no right, effectively, to start the asylum process if they have arrived in a way that the British government does not like. The question I want to talk to you about is whether that can possibly be right. Is this the day that Britain stopped being a humane country with regards to our asylum law? So much of this is window dressing. So much of this is for appearances. So much of this is artifice. Very little of this, if any, is really going to make much difference before the next general election. The government has almost no time to do anything before the next general election. So much of this is about politics. And not least because, if you think about it, what you have here is half a policy. The policy, they're willing the ends, but not the means. The policy is to say that anyone who arrives irregularly is not eligible to claim asylum. The policy is to say, effectively, that unless you are part of a pre-established scheme, unless the government has effectively invited you here in advance, then you're not able to claim asylum. But that, of course, is predicated on the idea that so many of these people then turn around and go, all right, game's up, I'll go elsewhere. It doesn't work like that, believe me. I've spent a lot of time in northern France talking to these people. Whatever you think of them, the slightly inspiring but also in some ways slightly crushing thing is so many of these people genuinely think that they're being guided by providence. They think that they are being guided by something or someone, that they've already overcome so many obstacles to get to where they've got. So the idea of the Channel, which they basically just think of as a big ditch after travelling thousands of miles, or the British Home Office, which quite frankly might seem scary to some of us sometimes, but by comparison to the sort of states and the sort of places and the sort of governments and the sort of authorities from which they have fled, really is a bit of a walk in the park. It really doesn't intimidate them very much. So if they continue to come, which they will, and then you've willed the ends, effectively saying, well, once they arrive, they can't stay, but then you have nowhere else to send them, then what have you got? In reality, you're no further forward, and you won't have anywhere else to send them, because as long as they're from, which the majority of them are, war-torn, hopeless basket case states in many cases, then you can't send them back there. The Rwanda scheme won't amount to a hill of beans, certainly not anytime soon, assuming that the Supreme Court even declares it lawful, and in many cases you won't be able to send many of them anywhere, back there anywhere, anyway. So then what do you do? You're basically back to square one. And that's the big problem with this scheme. So much of it is about looking tough, but it doesn't actually address the actual policy problem. And so you will probably find that in a year's time, we have not progressed any further. And if the government's still in office, they'll be talking about another bill and another bill, making it even tougher and more draconian because they're unwilling to look at the fact or confront the fact that we're in a global migration crisis, that more and more states are becoming more and more unstable, and that Britain inevitably, it is not surprising in a world of ever greater uncertainty, that Britain ends up with a certain relatively small percentage of these people at our shores, and that we can't, as much as we might want to, drag ourselves into the middle of the North Atlantic and hope, close our eyes and stick our heads in the sand and hope that it all goes away. And effectively, that is what so much of this bill is about. And if we're really serious about tackling this stuff, we need to get real. And we need to have a government and governments which are willing to have an honest conversation with the voters about the reality of the world as it is. That it isn't Britain being a soft touch. It's about the world being harder and tougher. And by the way, if you think it's bad now, just like we were saying on the show yesterday, you just wait for climate change to really, really hit. And you find huge parts of the world becoming almost uninhabitable for half the year, if not more. And see what happens to global migration flows then, and see what effects it has. Britain is not an island, even though it is. And it cannot be removed from the big political forces which are shaping and driving our world.